Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many of you joining us today. I'm Julie Roll. I am the lead animator with the Energy Futures Lab, and I'm pleased to welcome you today to this event towards a geothermal industrial strategy, a conversation with Dr. Bentley Allen. Today's event is co-hosted by the Energy Futures Lab and CanGEA, the Canadian Geothermal Energy Association. And we're pleased to bring this conversation to you today, and pleased that you're all here to join us for the conversation. So geothermal, as many of you know and are intricately involved with, is becoming an increasingly important part of our net zero future. And while the geothermal industry has been around for a long time internationally, locally, the Canadian industry is still quite emergent. Many of you are entrepreneurs and you're trying to get projects off the ground, or rather very deep into the ground. And isn't it enough work for you to just have to develop your projects, let alone imagine creating an entire industry? So my applause and my hat goes off to you. This is hard work and there's lots to do. But we're heading in the right direction. So today we have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Bentley Allen, who studies and develops industrial policy. And he's recently completed an assessment of some of the best opportunities within Canada that he'll share with us. So we'll learn about what is industrial strategy, kind of what's the why of it, the what of it, and the how, and how can Canada take advantage of some of these emerging opportunities. So with the Energy Futures Lab, we always love to make this as interactive and dynamic as possible. So if you're able to, we invite you to turn on your cameras. We'd love to see who's here today. We would love to have done this in person if possible, but it's also nice to gather people from different geographies. I know there's folks all across Canada and even internationally on the call today. So if you're able to turn on your camera, it's great to see the audience that's here today. Okay, I'm going to start us off with a land acknowledgement. This is an important part of the work that we do in Canada, is around truth and reconciliation, and making sure that we're honoring the past, and kind of giving acknowledgement to the stewards of the land. So at Energy Futures Lab, we've all written personal land acknowledgements, and so this is mine that I'd like to share with you today. So I'm a lifelong member of Treaty 7. My ancestors homesteaded in Treaty 7. They were a humble people who escaped persecution and came to steward the land in eastern Alberta. They learned to work with the resources they had to generate food for their family and the community. Our family farm remains in the family, with the third and fourth generations continuing to steward the land. As a girl who grew up on an acreage and have lived my entire adult life in the city, a deep down part of me longs for that original connection to the land. I love spending time out there in the prairie and appreciating how much life can exist in what seems like a space of nothingness. As an adult, I've learned that the land our family survived and thrived on was stolen. I understand now how settlers, like my ancestors, pushed out the people who had been stewarding the land for thousands of years and many, many generations. The people of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Siksika First Nations, the Tsuut'ina and people of the Stoney Nakoda Nations, the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations, and the people who belong to Métis Region 3. I can't undo that past, but I can change the future. I can honor those original land stewards, and I can work towards healing relationships. I can also do my best to be a steward of the land going forward. And I ask you today, what could it look like for you to consider yourself as a steward of the land as well? Okay. So I'd like to turn it over now to my co-host, Allison Thompson, for some welcoming remarks for us today.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you to the Energy Futures Lab. Good morning, bonjour, français. Shakyamuni famously said in 1973, "The Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones." This was a quote that we often used in our geothermal consortium meetings in the early 2000s when I managed an oil sands geothermal project on behalf of Suncor, Nexen, Shell, Total, Petro-Canada, and others. At the time, reasons the industry didn't take off weren't because of some of the things you hear about today from companies trying to develop geothermal energy in Canada, namely a lack of financing, a lack of technology, skilled professionals, and access to land and project sites. It had more to do then with a lack of market. And that is a broad word that includes policies, regulations, laws. It also had to do with a lack of industry awareness. A longtime Cangia board member, Alex Richter, whom many of you know, soon fixed that with the creation of Think Geoenergy. Against the odds, Canadian content punches well above our weight class in global media, thanks to Alex. Now back to market. Cangia was formed to address the market and policy gaps and catch up to where CanWIA, the Wind Association in particular, and CanSIA, the Solar Association, were and were going. Those two groups have now joined and work in tandem. Cangia got busy with introducing and influencing new laws, policies, regulations. Indeed, Cangia changed federal law to even recognize geothermal energy as renewable, for example. But the handful of demonstration projects being built today across Canada are also extremely necessary to act as test beds for identifying other gaps in the markets and policies. Throughout this phase of market development, it was identified that what the industry lacked the most was an economist telling our industry story. It is important to recognize that there are many levers in play when you address and focus only on one, perhaps cost. You may not be optimizing them all. And economists can help our industry translate its many benefits into how governments and large energy consumers make their purchase and support decisions. Early on, Todd Hirsch, the chief economist from the ATB, was a geothermal industry supporter. Speaking at many events and going on the record in the media, he continues to be an industry supporter in Alberta and through his national media reach. When the Energy Futures Lab hosted a battery metals workshop last year and asked Dr. Bentley Allen, an esteemed economist, to speak, I knew we had found a strong voice for the Canadian green energy industry. The EFL and Cangia moved quickly to organize today's webinar and some follow-on activities. Like many of you, I look forward to hearing and learning more from Dr. Allen on how geothermal energy can contribute to a Canadian green industrial strategy. Thank you, and over to you, Dr. Allen.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Allison. So I'm really glad to be here today. As Allison said, I'm the resident fellow for industrial policy at the Transition Accelerator. And I'm really excited to be with you today. I'm really excited to share a little bit of work that I've been doing in conjunction with partners at the Smart Prosperity Institute and with the support of the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. The project is really on how to find Canada's future in a net zero world. And I'm going to start right there and talk about why we need to do that. So, Canada has to build the green industries that will position it in the decarbonized global economy of the 21st century. And part of the reason why this is so important is because almost all of our major trading partners are using green industrial strategies to position their economies in rapidly forming global value chains. So we can look at Australia, which is trying to basically capture the same sectors of the value-added supply chain as Canada would be, and they've got a strategy that highlights 5 main sectors, including carbon capture and storage and other ones that Canada is really trying to position itself in. The EU has really innovative battery and hydrogen strategies, and even the United States, which many people think of as not really engaging in industrial strategy, has what the sociologist Fred Block calls a hidden developmental state, which has all these, has DARPA and other organizations that really provide a strong supply push for the policies. And I would also note that in the bipartisan infrastructure law, which just passed before the break, there is $20 billion for demonstration funds. And in the US context, of course, that's very small, but that's going to change things a lot, especially in the Canadian context. And I think some of that will probably end up in geothermal, actually, some of that DOE money. But it includes $8 billion for a hydrogen strategy that has like specific concrete targets and looks really like a top-down industrial strategy like the one the UK has deployed, and is a real departure from where we really expected the United States to be at this particular juncture. So this is hot globally, and it's creating a very competitive environment for firms and for countries that would like to position themselves in these supply chains. So just a quick definition of what a green industrial strategy is, in my definition, it's really any intentional effort that the government uses to try to build green industries. And the graph on the right here is adapted from some work by David Victor, who actually participated in some of this research with us, and his work for the Energy Transition Commission. And they basically, tried to model where different technologies were on a diffusion curve and green industrial strategy is trying to move all these industries up the curve to early deployment, and into mass diffusion. So that's the why, and I'm happy to talk more about the why. I also think that the why in the Canadian context is particularly acute for two reasons. One is that we have a strong carbon price regime, and that's going to raise prices if we're not careful on everything from transport to home heating and everything else. And then, of course, in Canada, we have strong incumbents. We have an oil and gas industry and an automotive industry and other industries that are deeply sunk in and that have heavily sunk assets into the current status quo. And when you put those two things together, you can really unwind the energy transition quite quickly, dismantle the carbon price, et cetera. And so I think that Canada has an added impetus for a green industrial strategy, which might drive the cost reductions that one needs in order to relieve the pressures of a carbon price, but also to build a political coalition, to build organizations and industries like geothermal that are invested in the transition, that want to move forward, and that will provide a home for a lot of the skills in the oil and gas industry and in other legacy industries here in Canada. So we can use and harness that talent for the 21st century and over the course of the whole 21st century. So with that in mind, we embarked on a study that was meant to identify the opportunities for Canada in the energy transition. And we really started by placing Canada's status as a small open economy in a global context. So small here in a global sense means that Canada is a market taker, not a market shaper. Open means even if we want to reshore certain pieces of our supply chain, overall, we have to be open to the global macroeconomic context, and we have to be we have to have an export development strategy. We have to be able to generate income in the global economy if we want to grow long term. And looking, for example, at the top export sheet, you first of all notice that oil and gas is, of course, our top export. And if you're to zero out oil and gas in terms of the export table, you have to bring every single one of the next top 10 industries up 20% just to compensate for that hole in the balance of payments that we're going to experience sometime over the next century. So export development is a key factor. And then you also need to think about domestic value added. Where are the jobs going to be? Where are we going to add real value to the economy? And then we also need to think about those strategic priorities. Are there places where we cannot afford to rely on the global context, but we have to actually locate ourselves within in the North American supply chain or in the Made in Canada supply chain? So the government, really any government, any activity, any economist, any political economist has to start by positioning Canada within all of these factors and realizing that there's trade-offs, right? You're not going to get everything you want. So you're going to have to make certain sacrifices in certain places in order to balance and trade these mediating priorities. So we made our own scheme of this that really tried to prioritize Canada's ability to export economies and to really position itself in the net zero economy of the future by locating ourselves in technologies that were emerging rather than ones that are already formed, and that'll become important in a little bit later. That was one key aspect of our assessment framework. The other key aspects of our assessment framework were looking for the resources and inputs, and do we have competitive innovation advantages? Do we have research clusters? Do we have existing firms with really strong expertise that will allow us to build innovative industries, not just industries that are scaled or that are extractive in their fundamental nature, but in industries that really build on Canada's really strong human capital that we have throughout the country. And then the final assessment criteria that we used to assess whether or not something was a good opportunity or not was whether or not it had market potential. So when you really focus on each of these criteria, as we did, and then do a risk analysis as we did, we arrived at these top 7 opportunities, starting with medium and heavy duty zero emissions vehicles. And we focused on medium and heavy duty here. There's been a lot in the media lately about Champagne's efforts to secure a downstream electric vehicle manufacturer assembly plant here in Canada, and I think that will likely happen. And that's good. We need to replace the light duty vehicle sector that we currently have in Canada. But we also need to find areas of growth, and medium and heavy duty is an area where we could maybe capture more of the North American market share than we currently have in the automotive sector. And it's maybe a place where the technologies and the IPs that we're developing would be exportable as well. And so I think there's a real opportunity in medium and heavy duty zero emissions vehicles, both to displace some current imports that we're doing and improve our balance of payments that way, but also to really develop a world leading industry. And the rest of them I won't go through, but I think that a lot of you will be familiar with most of them. The one that I will highlight is green chemistry, which is a personal favorite of mine, because Canada actually has a lot of the industries that Canada has that it excels in, whether it's forestry or geothermal or battery metals or biofuels. A lot of these industries are actually foundationally connected to the strength of this country and its chemical expertise. And that's something that I would really like to see us try to collectively leverage. We can talk more about that if you like. And then we identified these like 4 structural conditions, which in and of themselves, we didn't think of as being good economic plays, but they're kind of necessary conditions in order to realize the other potential on this list. And then there's a couple more top economic opportunities that we highlighted as well. And notably, we didn't really highlight renewables as being a clear opportunity there. And that's because those supply chains are already really mature. We're not going to be able to compete with solar or wind in with China and with the US and Germany, which are really well positioned in that supply chain. And I could talk more about that too, the global nature of it and how it formed and how green industrial strategy really played a key role in securing those strong state positions within that supply chain. But geothermal is really interesting to me because it's earlier stage than that. And therefore you could make a case within the framework that we made that we should invest heavily in geothermal. We did not select it as a top opportunity because of the fact that geothermal industry is really at the demonstration phase, but that doesn't mean it's not a great opportunity that couldn't be realized. So I just, for the purposes of setting up the rest of this talk and coming out of that assessment framework, I just wanted to outline some key questions for the geothermal industry. My first key question would be, what's the prosperity proposition? What is the long-term value added of the industry to Canada's economy? Why is it needed? And what is it going to do in terms of jobs in rural and remote regions? What is it going to be able to do in terms of driving down the costs of energy in those places? And how is that driving down the cost and energy of those places going to have like a structural effect on the regional economic development of these places? There's lots of different ways to think about that, but I think that's kind of argument that the geothermal industry needs to make. The second argument I would say is, how can the industry align and sequence all the elements of the supply chain over time? And we're going to spend the rest of the talk talking about that, so I'm not going to get too much into it. And then the third question is really about innovation. How can the industry build innovation in order to improve performance and reduce costs over the long run? Remember that we're in this for the century, right? This is the 21st century global green economy, and any kind of particular combination of technologies that work right now are going to be outdated at some point. And industries that can build in incremental and iterative innovation into their basic business models and into the way that they organize themselves as an industry and as a supply chain are going to be really well placed over the long run. And so that's another key strategic question. And the final question, which I won't talk about too much today, but I would love to maybe think about this more deeply, is what are the creative financial mechanisms that will keep costs low in your industry over the energy transition? So whenever I talk to industry about industrial strategy, we end up spending a lot of time talking about how you need so much certainty in order to secure that financing that you need, or you need so much scale in order to secure the financing that you need. And so I think that there's a lot of, but at the same time, there are ESG funds and there are private equity funds that have money that needs to be keyed. And there are green bonds, and there are other things that are emerging fast in the sustainable finance space. And we need financing vehicles that are able to connect to specific kinds of industries and the specific financing needs of those industries. And so I think that's something to think about collectively as well. So now let's just transition to the how, and I'll set up the how by talking a little bit more about the Canadian context specifically. So, our critique of the Canadian context really starts by suggesting that investments that we make are often spread really thin across the sector, that the priorities are really fragmented across departments, because especially in the case of climate policy, we tend to see ECC, NRCan, and ISED, in charge of different pieces of the same supply chain, and it gets quite confusing as to how we're going to actually manage to develop a coherent strategy that runs across it. But also there's a federal provincial divide, right? So provincial governments might want to go in a certain direction, but the federal government's going in a different direction. And so and then there are different funds. There are different funds at different levels in different departments. And whenever you're starting to create a funding map for an industry, you immediately have 12 funds that all have a completely different requirements and are different stage. And it gets clear that we're not deploying capital in the most efficient way across all of these places. And then, finally, I would say that the funding model that we tend to have in Canada is that either federal or provincial is that we make one-off grants to individual firms. And in contrast, we're making the argument that the government should really focus its capital on top opportunities, that it should align actors. And our proposition is that you can align the actors in a supply chain and across governments using roadmaps. And that instead of one-off grants, we need a long-term strategy. And instead of individual firms, we need to talk about clusters or industries. And so I'll elaborate on all these points as we go along here. And I'll just say that something like a road mapping exercise was the #1 recommendation of the expert panel on sustainable finance. This was Kev Macklem's last gig before he became governor of the Bank of Canada, which is to really map out Canada's long-term path to a low emissions, climate smart economy by going sector by sector and creating an associated capital plan for each of those sectors. How much money is it going to take in order to transition this and secure its position in the economy? And there's been very little work on that exact, or often when I talk to the government, they tell me that they're doing it, but they're keeping it secret. So I would like this to be a public exercise where everyone is engaged in it and industry and government can really work collaboratively together on that. And in the mandate letters, I think there's some intent to really adopt something like an industrial strategy that I can read in the tea leaves here. This is from the ISED letter, and it specifically says that ISED should have a clear long-term investment strategy in order to support the strategic review of large-scale investments that target key industrial sectors. And that could mean a variety of different things. It certainly, in my experience, the Net Zero Accelerator has really been focusing on things like steel, which have high emissions, or maybe cement, and these are the kinds of things that they think of when they think of the Net Zero Accelerator. They're not thinking of building the top opportunities in sectors where maybe we actually have a much better opportunity in order to secure a future in decarbonization. They're really trying to count emissions. And so there's a variety of ways to interpret the implications of that for the geothermal industry. I might say one thing, which would be that thinking in terms of not your own sector necessarily, but what your sector can contribute to the GHG reductions of other sectors as being, and maybe creative applications of it would be something that I would think about as well. And then that makes it clearer what the industry is competing against. Like maybe hydrogen is being used to create thermal heat in a location where direct heat from a geothermal project could be potentially competitive. And you might convince the government to overpay a little bit in order to provide a downstream pull on the geothermal industry rather than, some kind of other competitor in that space. But anyway, these are things we can talk about in the Q&A. I'd be happy to get into them. A lot of my work on the how has really been focused then in not necessarily, it seems like I don't really need to make the case as much as I did 12 months ago, but rather I get asked more, how do you do this? Wait, how do you actually implement this? And so I start just by laying out 3 principles. The first is public-private collaboration. So industries and government need to find a way to work together, and they need to find a way to do that where they're creating really good, high-quality information flows back and forth between the industry and the government. And that really requires 2 things. First of all, it requires a bridging organization or an intermediary organization. That could be a public-private partnership. It can sometimes be an industry association, but industry associations do tend to be close to industry. And if you're thinking about this from the government side, you don't want to be working with someone who's just telling you what the industry wants. So either working with an industry association and independent expertise, or by working with an independent public-private partnership that gets its funding from the government, but is not too closely overseen by the government. There's a variety of different models here, but the point is to create independence and trust, really, between the government and the industry by catalyzing good information flows, and doing so by filtering and bringing in independent expertise, independent evaluations, and things like that. And those good information flows are really important because the government doesn't want to be just subject to the lobbying exercises of an industry, and an industry doesn't want to be dominated by a government that is doing its own thing without knowing what's possible or what's a really good idea. So you want to be able to bring the expertise up out of the industry, make it relevant to the government, and bring the government's purposes and publicly minded outcomes, from a countrywide perspective, to bear on the industry in ways that make sense. And all that is just really difficult to accomplish So public-private cooperation sounds like a good thing. It's really difficult to work on the institutional design of these things in practice. How does it actually work? And along those lines, we want to create this relationship, and we have to institutionalize it. We don't just want to make it ad hoc. That's the other thing that we like to do in Canada, is create a working group or create a task force. And then it runs for 9 months, and then it produces a report. And then the report sits on someone's slide deck for 2 years saying we should do this, but it never happens. So you have to institutionalize it. And you need to create a place where the government and industry are learning together. But in institutionalizing, you're often harming the ability to experiment, to be creative, to do new things, to explore the whole possibility space for an industry or for a particular technological solution. So you need to find ways to institutionalize experimentation and learning at the same time. And the third thing I often say is build a balanced portfolio. Now, this could apply to the economy as a whole. We want to build a balanced regional portfolio, a balanced temporal portfolio for 2030 and 2050, but it also makes sense within an industry. And industries know this, right? They know, okay, we're going to invest a bunch of effort and capital in this particular technology, but we all know it only has a 65% chance of working. And we know that the backup, is X probably. But they often forget to work on X while they're working on the line that they're currently working on. So industries themselves, if they want to be successful, need to build balanced portfolios of technological and commercial plays within their own industry. So this principle is both a national one, but also an industry specific one. Now, there's a variety of ways to operationalize these principles. The way that I explain this is really, we can talk about having a top-down strategy in which there are strong targets and strong benchmarks that need to be met, or we can think of a bottom-up strategy where really we're looking for a solution. And then at one end of the spectrum, there might be a government-driven strategy where the government is really saying, these are the technologies that we want. This is how we're going to arrange the supply chain, et cetera. And then there might be externally driven strategies where the industry is really taking the lead, or the industry and consumers are working together to form a market and the market is driving the decision-making. Or it could be that really public-private partnerships or industry-led consortiums are really driving the outcomes. And then in the middle, there are these collaborative spaces. So the UK wind strategy is a really interesting one. There are clear deployment targets, but it's a strong government-driven strategy. Investment is both controlled by and facilitated by a crown corporation called the Crown Estate. And that Crown Estate basically holds the deep domain expertise for that particular sector, and it takes an equity stake in the investments. That might be an interesting thing to think about for wind or geothermal in Canada. A Crown Corp that actually had some debt that it could take on. I don't expect that to happen, but it's an interesting proposal, and it's a way to think about how do you actually build an industry that is trying to deploy lots of gigawatts in highly specific locations, right? And you could think as an industry, everybody knows, and I don't know the geology well enough, right? But everyone knows that these top 3 areas are where we should focus efforts. Well, if the government's driving the process, then it can decide this is where we're deploying. Right? And we're going to create financial incentives for the deployment in the lowest hanging fruit basins or the lowest hanging fruit aquifers. And that's going to drive our investment strategy. So that's one option, right? But it's not always the most appropriate option. The UK CCUS strategy is not as government driven, partly because the UK CCUS strategy is premised on the fact that they want the existing incumbent oil and gas industry to take over. They don't want to be supporting and driving this forever. And that industry is already really well capitalized. So it should be more externally driven. But at the same time, there are clear targets. You are going to deploy this many megatons of carbon capture and storage by this time. Here in Canada, we're often told that we don't do industrial strategy, but I would submit that Aostra, which really built the oil sands, is a really good example of a bottom-up collaborative / government-driven strategy. It's a Crown Corp, right? So it had that government-driven aspect to it, but Suncor and others were really deeply involved in the work. And so it was, kind of fundamentally collaborative. And it wasn't targeted. It wasn't saying we're meeting the deployment targets for drilling, but it was an iterative research and development and demonstration fund that was really strongly backed. And something like that for energy deployment would be excellent. And there are other strategies. I would actually, where I put the Strategic Innovation Fund, you might put ERA Alberta in that same bucket, where it's receiving applications. It's not driving a strategy. Whereas Aostra was like, it's very clear what we're trying to do here. And therefore, there was a little bit more direction given. Now, in the middle of all of these, and what I tout as a good model for the Canadian country as a whole, is something like the EU battery strategy, where a strong public-private partnership, which is really catalyzed, which really works closely with the European Commission, is what's driving the strategy. So it's truly collaborative in that way. And they go around to both firms and government and co-finance everything. So it's also collaborative on the financial side. And the reason why I like this so much is because the federal structure of Canada is often listed as a weakness. While the EU has the same basic federal structure, it's got lots of independent governments that need to be brought together, that can't be told what to do, and it has a weak executive, right? The European Commission is not super strong, and in many ways, but it can provide lots of financing because it has cash, and it has its own investment vehicles like the European Infrastructure Bank. So I think of that as being a really interesting analog for Canada to study and learn from. Now, you don't have to pick one, right? Like an industry could benefit from multiple different kinds of institutions that were created to do lots of different kinds of things. The battery strategy is really meant to create an entire supply chain from scratch. AOSTRA was really meant to spin up a particular technology and get it to commercial phase, where a well-capitalized industry could then take over. CCUS strategy is kind of similar. Wind was different. There was no industry that existed to fund it. So anyway, lots more to say about that, but I'll leave it there. Now, how do you actually do this work? How do you actually get down and into the nitty gritty and really figure out what you need to do? Well, what we do is we argue that sectors and technology areas should think about the cluster that they're part of and engage in a road mapping exercise that would identify the strategic sequences and policy mixes that are really necessary in order to move things forward. So we center a cluster and a roadmap exercise on a core technology. So in this case, we would put geothermal here. And then we'd look upstream to what is the innovation capacity and the resources that your industry needs in order to really excel. And again, not just for the short term, but for the long term. And then downstream, where is the market demand pull going to come from? What are the end uses and markets where this is going to be most effective? And how do we align and work out timelines that is going to work for that downstream pull and the upstream capacity that we need? And roadmaps shouldn't just have firms involved. It should have everything involved. It should have knowledge and entrepreneurs and diplomats for export development and everything all involved. Here's how we do this. This is the example from medium duty and heavy duty vehicles. You have a cluster of firms, they're innovative, they're producing buses and forklifts and batteries and things like that. And then you have to look upstream to, if they're going to be competitive long-term, we're going to need advanced materials. We're going to need new alloys and the chassis and everything to keep the weights down. We're going to need a battery industry that's really highly efficient and is able to deliver metals against what is looking like increasingly constrained supply chains. You're going to need mining in order to bring those metals on board. And then on the other side, you're going to need advanced manufacturing, and that means cheap green energy and AI. And so you've got these structural conditions for a strong core technology industry. You can list those structural conditions and you can roadmap all those structural conditions too. And then you're looking downstream to the procurement and the end uses that you're going to need. And then you try to align everything. You try to align everything, again, by even if the government's not going to set targets, the industry can set targets itself. It can establish a 2050 vision. And I've kind of postulated, some work streams here for your industry. And we could talk more about how you would organize that and what it would look like. But the key is to set some clear targets for the industry. And then you can sort of backcast your way into a set of actions, really priority actions and sequences that will deliver on each of those targets. And then you can overlay the finance needs and the policy needs that are going to unlock the potential that exists in your industry. So just to conclude, governments really need partners for industrial strategy. I would say that the Canadian government is looking for partners. It's doing its own independent analysis of who would be a good partner or who wouldn't be a good partner. But what I've really noticed is that it's the industries that show up to ISED with a plan that end up getting some really good, strong action. And so it's not necessarily the most, it's not necessarily like they have a rational strategy, right? It's the industries that show up and that are organized and that have figured out a strategy for collaboration amongst themselves that end up securing the resources that are coming out of the Net Zero Accelerator and other funds that are being created. Industries can collaborate through road mapping exercises. This is a way to try to get everybody on the same page, to develop some clear targets, some clear purpose, and then really, once you've got priorities set and key actions identified, then you can really advertise your project pipeline both to investors and to the government, and to everybody else too, who then understand that your industry is serious and that you have a plan and you know what you're doing and that you've thought through all these things and that you've thought it through from a publicly minded perspective, and of course a bottom line perspective for the investment and everything else as well. So I will leave it there, and I'll just really look forward to sharing some conversation with you and opening it up. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Bentley. That was amazing. I've seen parts of that presentation a few times now, but I always pick up new things depending on which ears I'm listening with that day. So thank you so much for that. That's fantastic. There's a few things that are coming up for me. So I have a couple of questions that I want to kick us off with, but I also want to encourage all of you to join in the conversation. So we've set up a Slido for today. I put the information in the chat as well, but you can join at slido.com, and the code is GeoCan. Yes, GeoCan. We can do this. And so if you join us there, we actually want to hear who's here with us in the room today to a certain extent. So we've just got one poll question, and then we'll take some audience Q&A as well. So would love to know, what part of the geothermal industry do you represent? And so would love to see users engage with the poll and see who's here today, who we're chatting with. It was great to see registrations coming in. We had well over 100 register for the event today. So it's really exciting to see the interest in geothermal industry in Canada. I think we ran a similar session 2 years ago, and I think we maybe had 30 or something. So I think we're really tapping into something exciting here. It's great. We've got government, geothermal developers, industry organizations, lots of other. It's always hard to have a bucket for everyone. So also curious who else is here from other. Academia, interested citizens, and the innovation ecosystem. So great to see you here. I'm going to leave this poll up so we can capture a few more answers and responses to this. Just wanting to make sure we're getting folks in and using Slido. You can do it on your desktop, or you can do it through your mobile device. And once there are questions in there, you can upvote each other's questions. So, but one thing that I'm going to kick us off with as you folks are answering the poll question is, one thing that really stood out to me in that presentation, Bentley, was the industry portfolio, the need for industry to have a diverse portfolio of projects and demonstrations and maturities. I personally have never thought of it from that lens. I've thought of organizations needing to have a diverse portfolio, and I've kind of thought of, the innovation ecosystem, or the funders, kind of the governments, the funding branches of the governments having a diverse portfolio. But I'm really curious about that, because when I think about the geothermal industry, how many times have I heard there's almost as many types of geothermal as there are geothermal companies? It seems as though there's such a diverse array of geothermal types of projects. And so I think in one regard that has been seen as a hindrance, because it hinders understanding what is geothermal. Well, if you only know about one company and what they're working on, that's what your understanding of geothermal is. But in some ways, it actually, I wonder if it's de-risking and validating different parts of the market and different approaches. Do you have any thoughts or insights on that in terms of developing an industry portfolio?
Yeah, absolutely. This has really come up in work that Julie and I are doing with the Battery Metals Association of Canada. And I think a concrete example is probably the best way for me to answer that question. So in the battery metals industry, there's a lot of uncertainty about, what battery chemistry is going to matter. Is it going to be a nickel-rich chemistry, or is it going to be a lithium iron phosphate, or is there going to be a lithium sulfur chemistry in the future? So that source of uncertainty is really generative in terms of creating a strategy. And then there's also uncertainty actually about how much mining capacity there is. So how much minerals will be available actually for each of these three chemistries. So from the get-go, you've got these two sources of uncertainty. And when you're building a strategy under uncertainty, the first thing you need to do is design your hedge. So the hedge is to make sure that you're putting the right amount of effort into each of those chemistries, and that you're putting the right amount of effort into the upstream needs for each of those chemistries. And so what I would say is I don't know the industry in geothermal well enough and what the technological needs are for individual firms. But what I would say is what you would want to do is at least have try to clearly identify where the bottlenecks and where the barriers are on the technological side, and then try to cluster firms around which one of these are like the thing that we are worried about the most. And then you've got some kind of sorting device. Okay, is it in the drilling, or is it in the heat exchange, or whatever? And then both as an industry and as these different clusters, think about how you're going to grapple with uncertainty in that particular context. So what I tend to see a lot actually in talking to industry is that folks treat uncertainty as a barrier. And I would just say, just treat it as uncertainty and tell me what the hedge is. Don't tell me it's a barrier. Tell me it's a form of uncertainty. What is it that you're uncertain about? And design a strategy that allows you to explore which possible solution to that is going to work and which isn't, and just make sure that you're balancing those. So that's what I would say, is focus on the uncertainty, not on the barrier.
Great. Wow. Yeah, perfect. I think that's so true. We see uncertainty as a barrier so often. Okay, that's great. I'm going to go now to the Slido questions. We've gotten a few upvoted here. So the top one here is your thoughts on carbon credit trading across provinces. It seems as though it's maybe dysfunctional between BC and Alberta at the moment.
Yeah, does someone want to elaborate on the second clause there?
Yeah.
That was one from Kenji. It can apply across anywhere. We see provinces trading or being allowed to trade with American states, but not actually between each other. And if you look at the participants today, we have a lot of people from Alberta, but if they're doing projects in other territories or provinces, those investors may not be able to claim those carbon credits. And just hoping that Canada can maybe act more like Canada. And maybe your thoughts on that, what you've heard from other industries.
Yeah, the Climate Institute, the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, just did a report on all the different pricing initiatives that are in Canada. And so even though we have this pan-Canadian framework, the wealth of different kinds of systems that are being used to price, whether it's a cap and trade system or a true price system, is really mind-boggling, and there absolutely has to be some rationalization of that. I think ECC is seized of that. Like, I think that the reason why we saw that CICC report is because Environment and Climate Change Canada knows that it needs to develop a kind of rational structure for interchange between the two of these. But absolutely, I think, again, BC and Alberta do not need to wait for the federal government to act. And what I would like to see specifically is much more targeted measures being used. There's this tendency, I think, for governments to think about regulating the whole thing, right? So I've been in some conversations here in BC about how to bring the CCUS industry online. And one idea that has been put forward is, well, actually just cap cement emissions from cement production, and say that the only way that they can generate credits is if they use CCUS, and that provides demand pull for a nascent industry that you have in BC. And from a BC perspective, I think that makes sense. You've got a lot of firms that are ready to deploy, and you need to provide an incentive for them to do though. And you have a giant emissions problem, and you have really strong emission standards that the government is trying to fill out GHGs. So you've got a real strong connection there. And the argument against that is, well, why would we do something so small, something so not going to help? Because what we should do is have a carbon regulator that's like, an electricity regulator, and to make a big utility. And so everything gets pushed up to the abstract level, like we need a rational Canadian carbon price or something. Whereas I think what I would like to see in terms of credits that we're able to interchange across provinces is they could both think about how to just harmonize their particular systems. And I don't think that would actually be I don't think there would actually be any problem with that under the Pan-Canadian framework. And they could make these things much more targeted in order to bring on certain industries that were priorities for Alberta and BC, but that are not priorities for the rest of the country. So if you think about the technological profile of economic opportunities in the West, like if I were to do this study that we just did, just for the West, I think the technologies that would come out would be different, right? Like we would be focusing our energies on different technologies. And what I would really like to see is for the governments to get down and think about their credit systems in relation to specific technologies that they would like to provide demand pulls for, and use credit systems as a way to drive industrial strategy. You know what I mean? Because industrial strategy tends to be thought of as, oh, we're just doing research and development. But in my scheme, right, where you have bottom-up industry-driven strategies, those are market solutions, if you want to think about it that way, right? But they're market solutions that have been tweaked to provide demand pull for a particular industry. And if you look at, for example, China's EV strategy, they copied California's dual credit system, but they made tweaks to the requirements that made sure that they were incentivizing Chinese firms instead of Tesla and VW, because the battery chemistries that those companies are using are just different than the Chinese companies. So they found this really like backdoor, interesting way of tweaking a market credit mechanism in order to provide demand pull on the technologies that they wanted to do. And I think that's really smart, and I'd love to see that kind of thinking deployed in Canada. But again, it requires picking winners. But it might be easier to pick winners at the provincial level than at the federal level, is what I guess what I'm saying. And geothermal might benefit from that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, amazing. The next question, I feel you may have a lot to say based on your history and background about is what role do you think universities should play in helping enable this? In other industries, what's been most effective in your view?
Yeah, so this is great. So I almost know too much about this. That's a problem.
Maybe you're biased.
And coming up with a succinct answer. Yeah, so before my current role at the Transition Accelerator, I was a professor, and then before that, right before this current role, I was at the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. And the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions is its specific job is to involve and harness academia for the generation of climate solutions, not climate science, not like better understanding of the problem, but for technological solutions. And so in that role, basically my daily calendar was meet with this engineering professor who is actually doing what you are suggesting. So I have this really granular knowledge of what works and what doesn't. But I think moving up to a level of abstraction or a level of generality, I think that the key thing that we need is for an industry like geothermal to really embed itself in those research networks of the universities, and to create both regional clusters. This is a key lesson of the innovation studies, is that you want to have regional economic development strategies where there's lots of exchange and interchange within a region between the universities and the firms. So I think that, focusing on place, I think is really important. Actually building places where people can interact creatively between universities and industry is really important, and creating organizations whose job it is to create this hybrid interchange, like the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, but also, Stephen Wilson at Foresight in Vancouver has a climate connections program where he brings academics and makes them tour plants, right? Makes them tour heavy industry decarbonization sites to make sure that academics actually understand what the problems are in the actual practice. So I think of those things as being really important. And then you need to provide the funding that will allow that research to happen in a catalyzed and catalytic way. And the model at PICS was really co-development. Industry and academia should work together. They should both be in the research project. We tend to separate these things into a linear model where academics do early stage, and then we try to accelerate or transform that or exchange that into then industry. But why not just put them together right from the get-go? And I think there's a lot of concern about that. I think about making academia too responsive to industry, and you don't want to water that down in any particular way. But I do think that this co-production or cooperative approach would be really good. And the key to me, like in other industries, what has worked well is when you have somebody making the funding decisions about what research to fund and what research not to fund, is not controlled by industry and not controlled by academia, right? But controlled by some independent organization in between the two, because industry will tend to fund certain kinds of things and academics will tend to fund certain things, and those might not be what is publicly minded and what is needed. So what has really worked well is when academics are heavily integrated into these independent research and development and demonstration vehicles. So Aostra, I think, is a great example. That was, the fundamental technologies were coming out of the universities and going into a place where there was tons of money to deploy. And the same thing actually built the fracking industry in the United States. You had really strong research coming up out of the universities, out of specific regional research centers, but there was tons of deployment funds. So you're engaged in a process of collective public failure. And so if industries can be involved in collective public failure, then they're doing their job right. And eventually somebody will figure it out, right? And we get really afraid of picking winners and all these other things, but picking winners is not what industrial strategy is about. Industrial strategy is about catalyzing public failure, de-risking public failure, because public failure is a public good, and it's a public good that no firm wants to invest in. So yeah, we need to try ideas that don't work. And so integrating universities into demonstration funds that aren't always needing to go to somebody, an industry person, for a handout because it's going to be near commercial, that I think is really key to involving universities in these innovation processes in ways that work.
Yeah. Wow, fantastic. Roman, I know you put in your question that you're from the University of Calgary, and I know there's been some changes recently in the structure there with a geothermal program. Is there anything that you wanted to kind of say about that? We could maybe hear like 30 seconds or so if there's something that's kind of important for us to know or hear about from the academic side of this industry and what's shifting there.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that was a wonderful point about having that independent middle person, because like as academics, we have our own, let's say, needs and things that we get ranked on. Industry has their own things, plus also the timelines between the two of them are vastly different. I know some of the folks I work with occasionally get frustrated with me with how glacial we as a university can be. But also that idea of, let's say, that rapid public failure, I think frequently we're pushed to publish successes. We rarely are pushed to publish failures, like things that don't work. But just like stepping back to what's going on at the University of Calgary, we have a new initiative called the Geothermal Energy Lab, which is collaboration between engineering, science, and law. And we're working on adding public policy as well. And the idea there is to try and act as not quite that middleman, but like maybe slightly a level above the standard researcher to help connect ideas across these different levels. Because I think we've all realized a perfect engineering solution will not be built if we can't convince the regulator and also the society that it's the right thing to build.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that overview as well. I know things are so dynamic in the entire industry overall, so it's nice to hear kind of that update. We've got a few more questions from Kanjia, and oh gosh, I can scroll down. There's lots of questions. Sorry, I wasn't actually scrolling. Okay.
And James has a good one in the chat.
One in the chat. So let's pull James's over for now so we don't lose it, and then we'll go back to Slido. So is supply side innovation sufficient to meet the economic sustainability challenges we face in Canada? If not, what needs to be happening on the demand side of our economy?
Yeah, I think that this is a great question, because I think that Canada and the US, if I was going to put them in a type, it would be, they try to do supply side innovation or supply side industrial strategy, where we just provide that bottom up push and then really hope that at some point a financier comes along and commercializes, helps the company commercialize. And so we're leaving, we're basically privatizing the demand pool. Let's put it that way, right? Now that's not totally fair, because there's obviously government funds that are helping here. But even those government funds they're passive, right? Like the SIF, at least as far as I can tell, is just receiving applications. They're not going out and doing business development and these other things that InnoEnergy in the EU context does. So I do think that, and that might be sufficient, like if we didn't care about the timeline, right? Like if we just said, okay, what we want to do is build as efficient and as lean an energy system as possible, or an economy as possible, then yeah, maybe we would stay doing that or whatever. But we have a time constraint, right? Like if we take net zero seriously, that sets up imperatives for 2025, right? And working out what those imperatives are for us is the most urgent task that we have over the next 2 or 3 years. What do we have to get done by 2025 in order to meet a net zero imperative? And if we treat it as an imperative, then we can't wait for supply side to do things. And I also just think that with a big demand pull right now, we would catalyze that process of collective learning that needs to happen, right? And we would drive cost reductions much more fast than we thought that we would, and things that are not commercially viable now will become commercially viable sooner than if we let them up just to limp along in the market. And yeah, and I think geothermal is probably a great example of that, right? Like it could take a really long time to get your cost curve down from learning and deployment, or it could happen in a shorter period of time with more demonstrations and more experiments. So I do think that demand pull is really important when you're on a specific timeline. And I think that that demand pull is really limited when it's just government procurement. So finding ways to leverage public finance into big downstream markets, that's, to me, that's where we're starting to get somewhere. So like the Canadian Infrastructure Bank does a little bit of this, but all they do is provide cheap capital, right? They're financing people buying Lions buses, right? So they're providing cheap credit for other people to buy those buses. So that's helping with the demand pull, but it's not truly scaling the demand pull, right? And so I think we need some creative thought about how we can get Bay Street and other financial centers in this country, such as the ones in Calgary and Vancouver, to work closely with the government, again, on timelines, on strategies, on targets, in something that looks a little more top down, even if it's still industry driven, not necessarily government driven, or something that's truly collaborative. I'm sorry, you're all learning that I don't have short answers.
Lots to think about. Each question is its own, like adds more questions to the question.
These are all 1 hour talks, is all these questions.
Yeah, I know. This is why we left lots of time for conversations, right? And questions. So the new pop to the top question is, how do we address greenwashing? 1% blend of biogas and natural gas gets labeled renewable, but renewable heat from geothermal is renewable heat. So how do we address greenwashing?
Yeah, so standards is the answer. But again, I think, having really good technical experts who understand life cycle analysis involved in standard setting and regulation is the answer to that question. But there's always a political pressure on those technical experts to just like lean open those standards just a little bit and wedge them and get loopholes built in and things like that, right? So I tend to be a much bigger fan of things that are clear and simple, like mandates. We are going to deploy clean electricity. Those things initially tend to be not as cost effective, but they bring the cost of things down dramatically over time, because you're basically providing that demand pull that we just talked about. So I tend to be in favor of things that are really, really simple, right? And so blending, we can't have 1%. It's got to be, it has to be 30% or 60% or something like that. But really just, making it more clear that we need to be net zero by a certain period of time, and putting mandates in place that I think direct that. I think that's the short answer to that one.
Excellent. You made a point about if we're going to replace the 20% that we're missing from oil and gas. Can you repeat that stat? That went by in a flurry.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you just look at the table of Canada's top 10 exports, and this is divided up by these, input-output table codes that StatsCan uses that make no sense to us intuitively, but and you zero out oil and gas. You could do that by 2070 if that's what your projection was. The numbers that I was quoting with 20%, what you do is you take oil and gas to 25% of its current export levels, by 2050. And that creates a hole in the balance of payments, basically, right? About $100 billion of exports that we need to make up as a country. Now, balance of payments is important just from like a basic economic standpoint, which is that, you know, you can't continue to run a balance of payment deficit if you're not the United States. The United States can do it forever because it has the world's reserve currency. So it has this ability to basically run a balance of payment deficit forever, but the rest of us can't do that. So, you know, you need as many foreign dollars coming in as you're spending on imports going out. So that's just like a fundamental constraint on an economy. But to me, the balance of payments is more important as a consideration of how competitive are our industries in global markets. And as a small open economy, you know, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Canada, all of these economies, and Germany to a lesser extent, it's not small, but, you know, all of these economies are built on value added that comes from exported goods. We add value to goods, we export them, and we create better standards of jobs at home domestically than if we were just self-reliant on our own, right? I mean, that's how global value chains work. Then if you want to cover that hole created by zeroing oil and gas or taking it to 25% of its current exports, you need to take all the next 9 industries, the next 9 NACE codes, next 9 categories, and you need to increase them all 20%. Now, if you took any industry in the country right now and you said to them, you need to increase your exports, your global market exports by 20% in the next, you know, 30 years, that is not easy. You know, you got to basically grow, you know, 1.5% a year, which is a challenge. And you got to do it every year through downturns and everything else, right? So some years you're gonna have to grow 6 because you're gonna be zeroed out the next year because there's a global crisis on or whatever. So that's a steep ask of all those other industries. Now the rest of that industry is like, the rest of that list is like forestry, metallic ores, chemicals, which would include like plastics, but also battery chemicals and things like that. Automotive is number 2 on the list under oil and gas. A lot of people don't realize that that's our number 2 export. And you have to tell all those industries, increase your global market share 20% over the next 30 years in order to cover that hole. So that's the point. And to me, that is like that's an emergency. Forget the climate, right? No, I mean, the climate is obviously an emergency, but like, that's just another emergency on top of the other, right? And the good thing about green industrial strategy is that it allows us to tackle both of these emergencies at the same time.
Wow, I mean, that really does put it in context for what the task is. Yeah, Allison.
Really, if I may just make a comment about the emergency, I think the other dysfunction or disconnect is between those in government who are managing that, and then those in government who are permitting projects, who just don't seem to have the fire under them to actually help the transition happen, because the projects take so long to get permitted, even if they're renewable projects.
Yeah,
totally. I mean, somebody somewhere in ISED or in, you know, the trade office has done the calculation that I just gave you, but I don't see any implications of that publicly, personally. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how you can keep that kind of thing secret. Like, okay, we have a strategy for this. Well, you need to tell us what it is, because we can't help if we don't know what it is. So
yeah, indeed. Oh, okay. Shifting over a little bit more to internationally, Maggie's question is about, she was on a call this morning with Mozambique. I'm assuming some great energy folks from Mozambique. And they're putting in a 30 megawatt geothermal project over the next 30 years. So, 3 years, sorry, 3 years, 30 megawatts, 3 years. My apologies. Mm-hmm. Collaboration opportunity here. Maggie, do you want to just say a couple more words on thinking about collaborating internationally and developing kind of local geothermal industrial strategy?
Well, I'm asking the question, and some of the things that come to my mind are things like, you know, is there a technological sell to Mozambique? Are there consulting opportunities for, can we improve what they're doing because of some of the things that, Catherine Hickson and Allison Thompson have already worked out, and synergies and things. So that's kind of where I was coming from, more on that technical side than anything else, because that's where I hang out. So.
Of course. I wonder if this is a good chat box question. I don't know, Bentley, do you have anything to comment about that?
Well, actually, Catherine Hickson and I have been chat boxing it up on a private basis on this one.
Amazing.
But yeah, I just, and maybe they've got something that we can learn from it, like, how do we collaborate with other countries on stuff like this? I have no idea. Bentley, take it away.
Well, I don't know anything about geothermal in Mozambique, but I would love for Maggie to take me on a tour of the facility. That's one thing I know for sure. I'm sure everyone in this room would like Maggie to take them on a tour. But I would say that's exactly the kind of thing that we need to be doing. And this work is really hard work, right? Developing export markets for Canadian intellectual property and services and technologies is really hard work. And I think that a lot of the time we tend to think in terms of like hardware when we're thinking about international collaboration. Like what we want is for them to install a Canadian made machine. But like Denmark, another small open economy, does not create hardware in the wind industry, but it captures, for the size of Denmark, amazing value added in the supply chain just from doing the services, right? Like Ørsted is a project developer. It was formerly a Danish utility, right? Like it was an oil and gas firm, if you want to think about it that way, right? Like it used fossil fuels to give Danes energy, and it transitioned into the world's premier developer for wind. And it did that by doing services, right? By figuring out how you connect wind to the grid, how you do project development, how you study. So it just has lots of deep domain expertise in project development. And there are all kinds of spillover effects for the Danish economy as a result of that firm engaging in a services industry. I just use Maggie's prompt as a way to talk about how there's a variety of ways that you can collaborate. It's not just having Canadian tech there, right? Canadian expertise in geothermal is probably relevant to project development internationally.
Perfect. In your analysis of geothermal and other emerging industries, did you assess their respective climate impacts or potential to help avert climate catastrophe? I think that was part of the framework, but.
I mean, we're always looking for everything in order to make it on our list. Something had to have some kind of GHG reduction, but we didn't prioritize that because partly what we were trying to do was show what happens when you use a completely different lens applied to the same thing. So much of climate policy is really targeted to the greenhouse gas reductions. And again, I think of these things as being intimately connected. So this gives me an opportunity to elaborate on the political economy argument that's underlying the project, which is just basically that you're not going to get effective emissions reductions if you don't build green industry, because your carbon price scheme and your will to transition will be unraveled if you don't build these industries. So to me, that's a kind of really exciting, that's another kind of imperative, right? Like if you want to decarbonize, you need to not just focus on greenhouse gas reductions, but also focus on what the contribution is to transition. So that at the Transition Accelerator, where I'm currently located, the focus is on transition. And transition sometimes involves highlighting greenhouse gas reductions, but sometimes the transition need is actually to dislodge power as it's currently configured, right? And dislodging power is about building a coalition. It's not about doing a numbers game or a technocratic game. So I hope that helps you get inside my perspective, which is a little bit different.
Yeah, sure. You bet. Okay, most action seems to be needed at the provincial level of government. What role, for example, regulatory, but what role does the federal level need to play rather than should? So what role do they need to play instead of what role should they play, I guess is the question.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. what I would say is, this is just one thing. I could probably make a list of 7 if I had a little more time to think about it. But the one thing I would say is that there are synergies across industries that are really deeply provincially and regionally rooted that can be realized by a collaborative and nimble federal government. And those aren't words that usually get attached to the federal government. But I would say that just for example, in the battery industry, right? The nickel and the lithium tend to be Western, and the iron and the phosphate and other pieces of it tend to be in Quebec. And so you have this like kind of division in the industry that's regionally constructed, and kind of overcoming that, there would be a strong role for the federal government to play. Not even in provide, like they should be providing funding and doing all these other things. But in addition to that, they can just be networking. There's a literature now emerging in the political economy of industrial policy literature on network failures. And the idea is just that, you know, the bigger the Rolodex of a firm, the more successful it's likely to be. And governments underplay their own role in expanding the size of that Rolodex. And so the federal government needs to step in as a network collaborator, right? And so if it creates these big public-private partnerships, these spaces where firms can interact across supply chains, then it's doing something that really needs to happen to connect the provinces and those kinds of things. And then it needs to create a rational and simple pricing and credit framework, and a credit framework that doesn't let us do too much dodgy stuff with biological solutions. That would be another key thing, right? Because we actually saw how that went at the global level. We created a carbon price system under Kyoto, a cap and trade system under Kyoto. And then we had these giant credit loopholes. And what that meant was that governments could delay any kind of actual experimentation with decarbonization, because they could just achieve credits by attaching, you know, machines to reduce hydrofluorocarbons from Chinese factories. And then there were rumors even in the later days of that mechanism that China was building factories to attach a machine to claim credits. So we were basically increasing global emissions in order to claim credits that were supposed to be reducing emissions. But those credits had no additionality, which is to say that they weren't actually going to be removing anything that would otherwise exist, right? And they were actually stimulating the use of steel and metal to build these things that otherwise wouldn't exist. So we have to be really careful about making markets more complicated than they need to be. Right. And that kind of answers the question about, do we need a geothermal protocol to quantify carbon credits? I think, yeah, if everybody else is getting a carbon credit, then of course geothermal needs a carve out. But it would just be better if we just did away with that and just left it simple, and then had lots of demonstration funds that really seeded things up and engaged in the process of collective failure, which is what a price is supposed to do anyway.
Well, for example, in BC, there's just a fuel switching protocol. So it doesn't matter if you're biomass, solar, geothermal,
right?
Something
yeah,
else.
Exactly.
So, before we rush into getting more costly and bespoke things for the industry, making use of something more general is, perhaps more ubiquitous and easy for us to do.
Totally.
I think an important part of that question is around, does industry have to collectively push to rectify this? So, if the federal government acts as a network collaborator and setting up a rational and simple credit framework, how do they know that they need to do those these? So is it the industry that collectively pushes for that? I mean, this is kind of the basis of the first part of your talk, which is really around these roadmaps and how they're built. But any like kind of targeted advice on that?
Yeah, I mean, we just got to get into it. Basically, we want to explore that work. We can get into those details, and I got to learn more about the industry in order to do that. But always excited to do that work and to have those conversations.
Great. I love just like leaving whetting an appetite. Lisa, we will come to you. And I'm going to stop sharing screen because I don't know if I want to end on a doom and gloom question, but I have one more to add. So we're going to go to Lisa, and then we'll go to what might happen if we don't get into alignment with our main trading partners. And then I'll finish off with a question, but we still got a few minutes here. Lisa, over to you.
Yeah, so that protocol was my question, because I've got investment. I'm going to be operating and producing carbon credits in June. What surprised me is that the Department of Energy has not undertaken it as an industry initiative. They want a person or a company to lead the protocol development on their own nickel. Well, we've just not had the time. But greater than that, and Bentley, this is really the crux of it. CCUS has the same problem. I think the federal government has dictated a carbon price, but it has not acknowledged that the market will find ways to get there and that the protocols have to reflect that. So if CCUS attached to EOR never gets a credit, nobody's going to do it. Because that should be a good outcome, that we get to net zero barrels no matter how we can get there, as long as we can prove that we're actually lowering emissions. That should be the thing. So it's geothermal, it's now a waste heat protocol, but it's better than a waste heat protocol because it doesn't have the upstream or the downstream stuff where you've got fuel gas supply. So I guess these are really industry initiatives where the industry says, hey, put that price on carbon, no problem, but then let us have the mechanism where we can actually justify an investment because there's a real economic outcome against the protocol. If is that what you're saying about, that's where industry really has a job to do?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I do agree with that. And I think that that's exactly the kind of thing that you would put in a strategy that was, basically focused on the policy frameworks that are needed in order to catalyze things for the industry. So I would put that in the category of demand pull, right? Like that's a way to get demand pull. And then that helps create financial investment certainty. And then that helps you get upstream and bring the whole supply chain online, right? So 45Q in CCUS in the States, like when you talk to bankers and financial folks about that, I mean, they just treat it as a revenue mechanism. That's not a regulation or a credit or anything. That's just a revenue mechanism. That's just something that takes pressure off of the business model. And that's the same way it's done in UK wind and in UK CCUS. In UK wind, they did a contract for difference, which is basically like if wind is going to be more expensive than coal, then the government's going to basically pay to collapse the difference between those two. So it's keyed to a market mechanism, which is the price of coal, but it's also keyed to, which is important because as you kill coal, then the price of coal will go down, right? So it's key to have a government mechanism that will allow you to continue to maintain your parity with, existing power. And that would be the same, something similar that geothermal would have to think about as well, right? Like if it did start putting things out of business, then those things are going to get cheaper and yada, yada, yada. So I think that, I would put that in the category of those are demand pull policies that don't tend to get classified that way.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, the one question that was remaining from Slido was around what happens if we don't get into alignment with our key trading partners. And I believe this is around kind of on our green approach. So how climate concerned are we maybe? A couple thoughts, words on that? Yeah,
so just again, from another sector, here's a lesson from another sector. So the European Union and the US have had a steel dispute that was put in place that was because of Trump's tariffs that he slapped on steel. And that created a WTO case, and the WTO is a political organization, not a technocratic one. And so the EU and the US decided to try to work out a diplomatic resolution rather than a legal or technical one, let's say. And basically what they just did was they basically said, okay, we're going to end our WTO dispute and we're going to create strong industry standards for clean steel. And then we're both going to basically subsidize the hell out of our steel industries so that we can basically build a green steel industry, and then together we'll compete with China and keep cheap steel from China out of Europe and the US, but allow trade to exchange between the two of them. Now there's a lot of ways to think about that, but the simplest way is that that's a carbon border adjustment, which is to say that they're going to put some kind of tariff on place on the carbon content of steel, and that they're going to hope that they can, that nobody else causes a stink in the WTO about that, right? Or they just don't care if, like, they'll let Japan in, maybe they'll let Canada in, but you have to align with the standards, whatever the technology standards that the EU and the US come up with. And they say they've given themselves 18 months to do that, and they don't know what the technical details are going to look like. And now all the firms are going to have their say, because now Nucor's got to show up and say, we're going to use this process, and ArcelorMittal's got their own process. And then some engineer in the middle, poor engineer, has to figure out how to make those two processes both be a carbon intensity requirement that makes sense for a carbon border adjustment. And that's going to be fun and interesting to watch. But yeah, like Canada has to be involved in that conversation right now, whether it's through AMD or like ArcelorMittal or a different steel company, or whether it's through diplomatic channels with the United States. Like, we need to be aligned with those standards so that we know what they're going to be, so that our industry is ready to meet them as soon as that tariff comes on, right? And you could say that that's kind of thing is going to unfold across a lot of these industries, right? It's going to happen on batteries for sure, because the European Union is building a domestic battery industry. It wants to keep the Chinese battery industry out of Europe to the degree that it can. And Canada will have a really interesting choice at that point, which is whether to align with the European standards or to leave itself open to competition from China, but also maybe have more access to China's markets. And so, yeah, these questions of international alignment, again, they are often have a technical dimension, so you got to get into the weeds, but they have a geopolitical dimension, and that's what makes this stuff so fascinating to think about. And I don't know what the implications of that for geothermal would be, but these are the kind of dynamics we tend to see across all sectors.
Yeah, Allison.
Julie, just before we leave at the top of the hour, are you able to share that poll again about who the participants were today? From what sectors?
I think it resets it if I reopen it, but I can share it when we share the video afterwards with participants. I can share that graphic.
Great.
I don't want to reopen it and then lose the info. But yeah, certainly. Okay, amazing. So one of the things that I heard and wrote down during your presentation was kind of this collaborative nature of the industry, and we've seen this in lots of different industries. That's required to kind of get all the elements together for the industrial strategy roadmaps and things like that. I'm curious about kind of the nuance of a mature industry can come together and they know their points of competitive advantage, and they know what kind of information they'll release and what information they can't release, versus kind of a more emergent industry where it's hard to tell so far what your areas of competitive advantage are, right? Everything is an area of competitive advantage, so it's hard to share and collaborate. Do you have any thoughts on kind of best approaches for that, or is it kind of this public-private partnership where there's spaces for open dialogue and things like that? What are your kind of thoughts on that?
I would say that for sure, that you do need spaces for open dialogue, and everybody, I think, needs to. I mean, people will disagree about this, right? But my sense is that industries that tend to cooperate with one another and share information with each other, especially early stage industries, tend to overall do better than otherwise, right? And established industries, they get this idea that their own people are the smartest, or that their own method is the smartest, and that they don't want to engage in creative revisiting conversation. And that's exactly what dooms them, right? Because they're not really being open to innovation. They're not building innovation into their business models. They're not allowing disruption to affect them. So you do need to be open. What I would say, though, is that the government can help by creating big public R&D that requires some public collective learning. And if everybody is benefiting from the information because it's public finance that's being used to create it, then things are going to move faster, and people are going to be able to learn from each other. And again, that's what happened in fracking, and that's what happened in oil sands. Like, the basic technologies that built those industries were not proprietary, right? They were publicly produced. And when George Mitchell starts fracking in the Barnett Shale, he has to tweak hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling to make them work in his particular context, right? But he didn't even pursue a patent. And there could be a couple reasons for that, right? One is that he didn't think he'd get one because it was all public in the first place, right?
Right.
And the second was because, that maybe wasn't his play. The play was more in land rights or something like that, right?
Sure.
And actually, the way that I see DLE unfolding in lithium, for example, is it's kind of the latter, right? Like these companies are really focused on their asset that they have. And so they're happy to share information on process because it's the asset that they have. That is where they're extracting value. And so the IP is not really where they feel like they're adding that much. So they basically collaborate on IP and allow their assets to drive their bottom lines. And sometimes that means actually they need help from the other engineer because their lithium is at a lower concentration or a higher concentration or whatever, and they need somebody else's technical expertise, and they're happy to give it because they're part of this community. So I think there's lots of ways to kind of tackle that and think about that. They have to be, again, problem industry specific and worked out, and the government can take some pressure off and things like that. But also, you know, if you can think about your balance sheet in a different way, that helps too.
Yeah, definitely. Wow, that's really insightful. And it really sets up my closing slide, which is that today was brought to us with help and support from Prairie's Economic Development Canada. So interesting where we've got kind of this Industry Association of Cangia, the Energy Futures Lab, the Transition Accelerator. We're like, there's like and now we've invited and welcomed all of you to this sort of initial kickoff stage of this informal public-private partnership of having these conversations and working through this information and kind of understanding the potential of where we can get to. So so much gratitude to you, Bentley, today. So much gratitude to Allison and all of you who showed up and engaged in conversation and asked great questions and are trying to build this industry. So much gratitude to everyone today. So thanks so much, everyone, for coming, and we'll share the recording afterwards so that you can share it with your communities. And I hope you all a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.